Somebody can say good afternoon. All right, good afternoon. All right. So the priest and the minister and the rabbi met up for a picnic in the park, and they were talking with each other about their different religions, and they were all wearing their heavy black outfits, and it was such a hot day, and they were sweating. And they looked over. On the other side of the path, there was this nice little cheerful brook running along. And the minister looked at the other two, just walked right across the path, stripped himself of all of his clothes, hopped into the stream, and just sat there and said, "Ah." And the other two, they looked at each other, and they looked at him. And they went across the path, and they stripped off their robes, and they sat down in the stream. They felt good, and they were talking, and then they started splashing a little bit. Next thing you know, the priest and the minister and the rabbi are just splashing naked in the stream, and they're giggling like children. But just as they were laughing, the Ladies Auxiliary Breast Cancer Fun Run came through the park. And with all of these ladies running by, and they all looked over, gasped to see these three guys. And so the priest jumped up and did this, and the minister jumped up and did this, and the rabbi jumped up and did this. And the minister said, "Rabbi, cover yourself." And the rabbi said, "You know, I don't know about you two, but in my congregation, it's my face they would recognize." And, you know, as I said in our last session, there is such a wonderful joke tradition of the priest and the minister and the rabbi, or the imam and the priest and the rabbi. And something that these jokes tend to have in common is this idea that the rabbi is going to do something unexpected, or that the rabbi is going to see the problem. He's going to see the same problem from some quirky angle that's going to be different from how the others see it. And this long-standing humorous tradition, and I should say here that this seems to be one of those traditions that probably comes from Jewish humorists, that it's not so much making fun of the rabbi, but just showing that the rabbi looks at the same problem in a different way. And I think that these jokes do have some basis in this idea of Judaism being kind of a quirky religion, being the one that's different from the others, and a religion that is defined by outsiders and insiders alike. It's sort of defined by its differentness. It's defined by its kind of quirky laws and its quirky diet and its quirky clothing and all of this stuff. And we don't need to, when I say quirky, we don't need to read that in a judgmental way, or in a way that implies inferiority or stupidity or whatever, but just difference. And so today we're going to continue our exploration of the development of Judaism. But we're going to keep an eye out for that. What is that differentness, and how is that differentness important? How is it actually valuable to be different? So our story begins here in the land that we know of as Israel, Palestine, and just as a reminder, because Israel kind of looms so large in our discourse and in our consciousness, and we hear about the nation of Israel, the nation state of Israel, the country of Israel. And here, this blue sliver represents geographically the size of Israel on the planet in relation to the size of the United States. And this comparison here shows us the landmass of Israel in comparison with the state of New Jersey. So it's true that Israel is a country, it is a nation, but we also have to keep in mind It's a very small country. It's smaller than, what we might think of as like Germany, France, smaller than the United States, tiny. I mean, if we were doing this in a size comparison with China or Russia, we wouldn't even be able to see Israel. The sliver would be so small. Peter. Uh-huh.
You're showing of Israel. Is that the geography of the state of Israel, country of Israel, as it was defined when it was established by the United Nations in
1947, yes.
That's because it's occupying a fair amount more space now.
Maybe, I don't think, but that is possible. But I'm just giving us a general size, just for us to keep in mind as we talk about this very significant place where very significant things have happened and very significant things continue to happen. But we're talking about something that's very small, and it is important and it is valuable, but it's not valuable as the greatest farmland. It's not valuable as the prettiest place. It's not a nice forest. As a matter of fact, it does not have oil as far as we know. It does not have gold. It's got this scrubby, rocky farmland, which lends itself best to olives and grapes, and these are things that have, very small roots. They require very little water. They grow well in rocky, windy areas, and so even in biblical times, the primary exports from Israel, they could grow some. There were some areas where you could grow some grain, but the major exports were olive oil and wine. And also fish from the lake that we, for some reason, call the Sea of Galilee, which they would sell whole fish, but most of the fish that they sold was just little sardine-sized fish that they would grind up into a paste that they called garum. They mixed it with vinegar. It would kind of keep forever. You could travel with it. The Romans loved it. You could put it on a cracker like toothpaste. And it was an ancestor of what we know as Worcestershire sauce or A1 sauce. If you can imagine A1 sauce with anchovy paste. And that, but the thing about garum was that garum on a piece of bread that could keep you alive and working for an entire day. So that was their thing. Like when Jesus called the fishermen and said, "Leave your nets and boats and follow me." That's the industry that they were leaving behind. Or when Jesus met Mary of Magdala, Magdala was a fish processing town. It was a town that smelled like fish and vinegar. And so Mary was probably very happy to get out of Magdala and be able to wander with these guys. Anyway. Canaan, the land that we know is Israel, has been continuously populated, I think, for about 30,000 years. So when you think about it, humanity, which gets started in Congo, it gets started in Africa. Some say 3 million years ago, some say 120,000 years ago. That depends on how you measure the skull and what you consider to be like a fully human person. But humanity, beginning in Central Africa, spread to all kinds of places, very nice places. This was one of the last places that they settled, was like Israel and Arabia. It was like some humans got crowded out of other places and said, yeah, I think we can basically do this in the desert or in this scrubby farmland. When we enter the historical era, here is the land that we call Israel. It was known for a long time as Canaan. It was these, not one country, but about 30 little countries but each country would be about the size of a very small town or like a southern plantation. And once they began to settle and they got into some full-time farming, they immediately got invaded by Egypt. Egypt sent soldiers, chariots, and archers. They took over. They said, from now on, you give us 20% of everything. Excuse me. Excuse me. All right. Now, we all know that in the Bible, we are told at the end of the book of Genesis, there is a great famine that ravages the land. And the Israelites who are just kind of getting a foothold in the Bible, they go to Egypt. They don't get captured by slave traders. They go to Egypt and they say, we will work for you because you have stored grain. Egypt was like the breadbasket. That's how we get the Hebrews as slaves in Egypt. And the Bible tells us for a while, the Egyptians treated them well. And then there came a Pharaoh who kind of had no knowledge of the past and just decided that the Hebrews were slaves and that they were a big problem. They were a population problem. They started killing the babies, and then the Exodus happens. So then we get the Israelites. They establish their experiment for some time in Arabia. There's the 40 years in the wilderness, which means that they spent 40 years living like Bedouins, living like nomads in the Arabian desert. And then they finally enter into this land called Canaan. There is violence and there's kind of this overthrow. They set up their little country. They're getting set up as 12 tribes here. And then as we went over in a past session, some sea pirates from this area, whom we call the Sea Peoples, the Egyptians called them the Pelastu, we know them as the Philistines. Some sea pirates came, they tried twice to invade Egypt, the Egyptians beat them back, and then at the end of the second invasion, the Egyptians said, look, you're not going to take over Egypt by sea. But the Egyptians said, if you want land, go attack right here. That is how we get the great Philistine invasion in the Bible, is that the Philistines do. They show up here, they take the coast just like in this blitzkrieg move. They start moving in. The 12 tribes of Israel, they know that they are going to lose against the Philistines. They're going to be conquered, and they're going to become slaves of the pirates. In kind of a desperate grasp to maintain their autonomy, they gather all of their soldiers together, they put them behind this one general, Saul, and Saul becomes the wartime chieftain. Now in the Bible he's called a king, but he didn't have a castle and he didn't have a crown. Saul had he had like a bracelet that let people know that he was in charge during wartime. Saul actually does pretty well against the Philistines. He goes a little bit crazy because one of the Philistine mercenaries who keeps hiring himself out to whichever side of the war will pay him the most at the moment, this guy that we know as David. Saul becomes obsessed with the idea that David is going to kill him, Saul, and that David will make himself king of Israel, and that if David defeats his old buddies, the Philistines, that he will not return power to the people, that he will establish himself as a king. The Bible tells us that Saul was insane and that he was jealous and that he was delusional, but all of a sudden, Saul is betrayed on the battlefield. He is found dead with his body full of arrows. There are 3 conflicting accounts of this. What all 3 accounts agree on is that the next day David showed up wearing his bracelet and his clothes. And so the Bible tells us again and again Saul was crazy and paranoid and delusional, but that thing that Saul was afraid of is precisely what happened. Saul was dead. David showed up in his clothes. David finished up the war, declared himself king. And he turned Israel into this little nation state. And so then the Israelites, who had, their ancestors had escaped from Egypt, and they had done all this fighting to stop the Philistines from turning them into slaves in their own nation. Then they found themselves stuck in the nation of David, which became then a lot worse in the days of Solomon. And it's Solomon who they built the famous temple. Solomon did not lift a stone to build the temple. Solomon conscripted the population. Every single adult in the population had to, as part of their national taxes, had to donate their body for 3 months out of every year to carve stone, haul stone, build the temple, and build Solomon's castle, which was 4 times the size of the temple, which then led to a lot of protest in Israel and a lot of people saying, why did our ancestors leave Egypt? We have become slaves of Solomon here. Finally, Solomon died. His son Rehoboam was about to take the throne. They did a coronation ceremony. The people asked Rehoboam, are you going to be as bad as your father? And Rehoboam famously, the Bible tells us, he consulted with his advisors and they said, if you treat the people well, they will serve you. And then Rehoboam went to his 20-year-old drinking buddies and he said, what should I say? And his drinking buddies said, tell them this. And this is what Rehoboam told them. He got up in front of the people. He said, my little finger is bigger than my father's loins. He punished you with whips, and I will whip you with scorpions. And 10 out of the 12 tribes walked out. And they established a separate country. A country that was actually pretty prosperous, that actually got pretty wealthy and did pretty well. And it did well enough, what we know of as northern Israel actually did well enough that they got the attention of the Mesopotamians, the Assyrians, who came in, invaded it, set up a puppet government, and said, we're in charge here now. The folks down here, they bribed the Assyrians. They paid them everything. They stripped the gold from the temple doors. They gave them everything they had and said, don't invade us like you did to those people up there. They managed to keep their autonomy from 722 to 650 for almost another 100 years. And then one of their kings refuses to pay taxes to Mesopotamia. The Babylonians come in and they just smash everything. They destroy the temple. They drag the people to Babylon. They drag the Israelites out naked with fish hooks in their mouths, and they drag them to Babylon. And the people, on the way sang one of the saddest and most famous songs in the Bible, by the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept for Zion, which is the mountain on which Jerusalem stood. While our captors demanded of us that we sing some of our traditional folk songs and religious songs so that they could laugh at us. So this is this terrible time, the Babylonian invasion, the destruction of the temple. When the Babylonian Empire invaded a country, which they did really well, and they did it all the time, it was generally the people whose country had been invaded and whose temple had been smashed would generally agree our God or our gods could not protect us. Our God or gods were defeated by the Babylonian gods. Our gods couldn't even defend their own house, defend their own temple. They couldn't defend their own country. It turns out our gods were no gods. So most people who got invaded by Babylon became Babylonians, and their religions disappear from history. Among the Israelites, now we encountered this, and again, this is kind of a quirky people who tend to see things in different ways. When their country was invaded and their temple was smashed, they got this other idea. They got this idea that the God of Israel, who had always been a local God, but they got the idea that the God of Israel was actually the God of the entire planet, and that this God had used the Babylonian Empire as, and the metaphor they used was that God had used the Babylonian Empire like a stick to just hit his people with. And that God had used Babylon to hit the Israelites as a punishment because they had gone after other gods and they had done things that they shouldn't do. And so, here at this fascinating moment in the history of religion, this is really the first time that we see what we know as a universal religion, a religion that's not just the religion of this little country, but a religion of the entire planet and the entire cosmos. Egypt, for example, Egypt never tried to convince the Babylonians that the Egyptian gods were also the gods of Babylon. Babylon never tried to convince Egypt that the Babylonian gods were also the gods of Egypt. The Babylonians said, our God is the God of the world, but by the world they meant their country. The Egyptians said, our gods are the gods of the world, but by world they meant Egypt. It's okay, this is the point. I've put Peter to sleep. That's okay. I also ate one more sandwich than I should have, so like I'm in a little bit of danger of putting myself to sleep. All right. Now, the Babylonian Empire had invaded the physical boundaries of the Israelites. They had invaded Israel, and there was nothing that the Israelites could do about this. But they decided, even as exiles in Babylon, there was something that they could do. They could not protect their physical boundaries, but they decided to establish their cultural boundaries. And this is really when we see the development of what we know as the Torah. The Torah, which is to us the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And these books are most famous for their stories, but the bulk of the Torah is laws. The Torah contains the 10 Commandments twice, but it also contains 603 other commandments. So, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that. There are 613 of those commandments in the Torah, mostly in the books of Exodus and Leviticus. And then you get a whole other set of laws in the book of Deuteronomy at the end. And these laws, the primary focus is on maintaining the family unit, the household unit. Things like you'll honor your mother and father, and you will not do this around your siblings, and you won't do this around your parents, and you won't do this around your kids, a lot of that stuff. And also the kind of what we could call a sort of tribal unit, like this is, you won't do these things to or toward other members of this group. Now, we can say, well, the Torah says, thou shalt not kill. That did not apply to killing an Egyptian or a Babylonian. That is only, you will not commit murder within this community unless the community sanctions it. Because we got to remember, one of the 10 Commandments says, thou shalt not kill. But then after the 10 Commandments, it says, anybody who's caught doing any of these things will be put to death. They are all capital punishments. But it's because what we sort of mistranslate, thou shalt not kill, what it really means is thou shalt not murder. You will not personally decide to take the life of another member of this community. But if you can prove that they have been worshiping other gods, then the whole community can get together and throw rocks at them until they are dead, which is the standard punishment, standard execution in the Torah is throw rocks at somebody until they stop getting up. All right. So the Torah, here you've got these Israelites who've been dragged into Babylon, and there's the question, are we going to assimilate? Are we going to evaporate into Babylonian culture? And some people begin to put it together. The best way to hold this community together is, for example, to eat separately. We are not going to eat with the Babylonians. We're not going to drink with the Babylonians. We're not going to socialize with them. We're not going to go over to our Babylonian neighbors' houses for dinner. We're not going to invite our Babylonian neighbors to our houses for dinner. Now that's how Judaism develops its quirky diet, this whole idea of being kosher, which we all know it's kind of a challenge when you're to invite your Jewish friend over for dinner and they say, well, but remember, I can't eat this, I can eat these two things, but you can't put them on the same plate, and you gotta, if you're cooking this, you gotta use this, if you're doing that, you gotta do, and you say, oh my goodness, what is this? Why is it such a special pain in the backside to have my Jewish friend over for dinner? The reason is because that's how it was designed. It was designed to make sure that the Israelites would not be eating and drinking with the Babylonians, because they said socializing with others is the first step in losing your own personal identity. So all of that stuff in Judaism about this is how you cook, this is how you clean your house, this is how you dress, this is how you're going to look different, talk different, act different, celebrate different holidays, eat different foods. All of that stuff, that quirky stuff about Judaism, that was there to keep it alive against incredible odds. And essentially, to establish this semi-tribal community even within this massive empire. And so people actually did manage to keep this thing alive, even though the temple had been smashed and the country had been invaded and people had been dragged off in chains, by coming up with this law code. They managed to stay separate and to stay different enough. And they managed this for about 50 years, until the Babylonian Empire fell to the rising Persian Empire, and the Persians said, we don't even feel like dealing with this. We don't, like the Jews, they stick out. This is not working out. And the Persians actually rounded up all of those Jews who had been like kind of hiding out in Babylon, and they said, you know what, just go back. You go back to where you can have your land back, you can have your stuff back. Get out of here, go be quirky somewhere else, because you just stick out here. In the Bible, in the book of Esther, it tells us that the Persians decided that they were going to kill all of the Jews. There's no evidence of that. It seems that the Persians just said, you quirky people, go be quirky in your own land. All right. Of course, the Jews who are returning now from Persia, and they've returned, and the Persians have given them basically like real estate deeds, saying like, we'll let you have the land. They get back and they find that the land has been continuously occupied by sort of the farmers and shepherds who stayed behind. And there's a major problem here, and there's some unfortunateness about that. The rich people win, they get all the land. Whatever. So, what is developing now in this period is what we know as the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible, it is the same books that Christians would call the Old Testament. In Hebrew, the Bible is known as the Tanakh. That is actually an acronym. It is T for Torah, and this would be the Hebrew versions of these letters. But it's T for Torah, that's the first 5 books, the law. The N for Nevi'im, that means the prophets, which in the Hebrew Bible also includes the histories, the things, the stories. And then there's the Ketuvim, the writings, which is sort of a miscellaneous Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes. So you put this all together. We think of this as one book, or we think of this as the first half of one book. We got to remember, though, that originally these things are just scrolls. They are different. It's a library of scrolls. They managed to reestablish this. In the beginning of the Common Era, Israel was a Roman colony. It was not called Israel. The Romans called it Judea, which means the land of the descendants of Judah. And that is how we get the word the Jews, meaning, again, the descendants of Judah. Judah is kind of a strange place to start. He is one of the great-grandsons of Abraham. Rome does not name the place after Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, but instead after this kind of obscure guy. And the religion at the beginning of the Common Era, this is 2,000 years ago, the people, the exiles who have returned from Persia, they have built a second temple. So they've rebuilt the temple, they've made it bigger. It runs like that for a while. At the start of the Common Era, King Herod the Great is the king of Judea, and he has renovated the temple, which was this size, and now it's this size. And Herod the Great then does this other thing. He builds this massive courtyard around the temple, which is called the Court of the Gentiles, which is a place specifically for tourists. Because all of a sudden there's this kind of tourist trade of people who travel and they want to see Judea and they want to see these quirky people do their quirky things, but they can't go inside. Now the temple itself, only the high priests are allowed inside of the temple. So it's not a temple like this room where everybody is invited. Only the high priests are allowed inside. Here in front of the temple are these 2 altars for offerings. Here are the places where Judeans can go. They can exchange their money. They need to make temple offerings, which means that they need to sacrifice lambs and birds. If you can't bring a lamb or a bird with you, there's somebody here who will sell it to you. But the money that you use to buy your lamb or your bird cannot be foreign currency. It can't be currency that has a picture of any foreign god or any foreign emperor on it, because that's considered idolatry, blasphemy. So when you show up to the temple to make your offering, first, whatever coins you have to go to one of these places and change those coins for temple money. And then you can take your temple money to another one of these places and you can buy a lamb or a pair of turtle doves or whatever it is you're going to sacrifice. So, in the Gospels, when we read that Jesus went to the temple, stood on the steps of the temple, he never goes inside because he's not allowed. But he stands on the steps of the temple, he takes a bullwhip, he chases out the money changers and the people who are selling birds. Actually, that was the temple industry. That was how the thing ran. And then meanwhile, there was also this court of the Gentiles, which was just tourists who were not allowed to come into this area, and they definitely weren't allowed to come into this area. So the temple complex becomes actually this really big thing. In the Torah, everybody is required to sacrifice animals. For example, if you can imagine this, every household is required to sacrifice a lamb every year for Passover. That means either you bring a lamb or you show up and you buy a lamb, and it has to be slaughtered on the steps of the temple. Every time a woman finishes a menstrual cycle, she is required to go to the temple and sacrifice 2 birds. So that means there were people who had to travel there every month for like 30 years. Every time you had a baby, you had to go there and sacrifice a lamb. If you couldn't afford a lamb, like Jesus' parents could not afford a lamb, they went there and they bought 2 turtle doves and they sacrificed those. The temple was nonstop sacrifice all the time. The priests had goiter because of the amount of meat that they were required to eat. They were very, very unhealthy. And also near the temple was this organic garbage dump of all of the animal bones that occasionally they had to set it on fire. The animal garbage dump was called Gehenna. And Jesus would say things like, if your right hand causes you to sin, it's better to cut it off and throw it into Gehenna than for your entire body to go into Gehenna. And this is how we get the Christian idea of hell. But actually, in Jesus' time, there was no hell. But there was this organic garbage dump. It smelled terrible. It got kind of diseasy. And every so often, they had to douse it with oil and set it on fire. So people had this very vivid familiarity with, like, there is a place of flames and stench, and the fire never goes out, and the stink never stops stinking. But for them, it was a real place, part of the temple complex. All right. Well, that's kind of a lot. The temple's about to get destroyed again. Should we do that next time? Let's do it now? Okay. Now, Judea is a colony of the Roman Empire. Now, in the year 70 of the Common Era, this is 40 years after the death of Jesus. In the year 70, there is an uprising. Now, remember, people kept asking Jesus, if you are the king of the Jews, when are you going to lead us in a violent uprising? Jesus keeps saying, that's not what I'm doing. When Jesus is about to be crucified and Pontius Pilate says, I'm going to release one person. Do you want Jesus of Nazareth, the peaceful protester? Or do you want Jesus Barabbas, the revolutionary leader? And people say, give us the revolutionary leader. This is something people really wanted. People kept trying this. They kept getting crucified for it. However, 40 years after the time of Jesus, the Roman Empire kind of had this hiccup. It sort of had this weekend of disorientation or confusion or whatever it was. And the Judeans did one of their uprisings, and it succeeded. And they did manage to kill off the Roman police, kick out the Roman governor. They managed to actually they managed to liberate themselves by violence. The word of this spread throughout the Roman Empire. Everybody was like, what is this little country that nobody's ever heard of that managed to defeat the Romans? Everybody in all of the Roman colonies started gathering up their picks and shovels and turning their, pruning hooks into spears and saying, now we're going to do it too. And the Romans said, absolutely not. They sent the army in full force. They attacked Jerusalem. They destroyed it. They left not one stone standing on another. They tore down the temple. And then they burned the rubble. They set the rubble on fire. They dragged all of the temple stuff to Rome. They made a law that Israelites were not allowed on the mountain of Zion, Jerusalem, ever again. They banished the people. They renamed the land, and they said, you are not going to be, this country is no longer going to be called the descendants of Judah. The Romans said, who did the Israelites hate most in all their history? And somebody said, the Philistines. And the Romans said, okay, from now on, we're going to call this the land of the Philistines. And the Romans renamed it Palestine, even though it wasn't occupied by Philistines at the time. But Rome just did it as a way of saying, this place is entirely defeated. They minted commemorative coins that said Judea capta, Judea has been recaptured. They spread them all over the empire, and everybody who had this moment of revolutionary optimism was like, no. These people, they did manage to rise up against Rome, and now they have been hurt worse than Rome has ever hurt anyone before. And no, we are not. Our revolution is canceled. All right. Now, with the Judeans banished, with them not allowed to go onto the mountain, so they can't sacrifice at the temple because there is no temple. They can't even sacrifice in the place where the temple once stood because they are legally barred from even setting foot on that mountain. And one of the laws in the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, says the only place you're allowed to sacrifice animals is in the temple itself. This is when, in the year 70, sacrifice ceases to be a part of Judaism. So if you said today, I want to learn about Judaism, and you open up the Bible and you read the Torah, everything in it would be like, if this happens, sacrifice 2 doves. If this happens, sacrifice a lamb. If this happens, sacrifice a goat. Everything is sacrifice. None of that happens anymore. None of that has happened in almost 2,000 years. As a matter of fact, one of the most disastrous things that could happen this year, and I so genuinely hope that the Israelites have thought this through. If the Israelites exterminated all of the Palestinians, they would have to build a temple. They would have to build a 3rd temple. But if they built a 3rd temple in Israel, international rabbinic Judaism would be over. All Jewish people would then revert to the requirement to sacrifice lambs, goats, and birds at the temple, which means you couldn't really be Jewish and live in New York. Because you can't live in New York and then go to Jerusalem to sacrifice 2 birds after every menstrual cycle. You would kind of have to live there. And that would be a global disaster. And so, when I hear that the Israelites are going to kick out the Palestinians once and for all, it really gets me thinking, well, hang on though, have you really thought this through? Because you can't build a 3rd temple and not use it. And you can't own the land and not build a temple. So that could be a mess. For our purposes today, the destruction of the temple, the end of animal sacrifice, is not going to be the end of Judaism. It's going to be the beginning. The temple priesthood is gone, and by priest, if anybody here has ever wondered what's the difference between a priest and a minister, a priest is someone who performs blood sacrifice. That is what a priest means. Like a Roman Catholic priest, an Episcopal priest, a Methodist minister, a Baptist minister, you can watch them both do the same thing with the bread and the wine. The difference is a priest, Roman Catholic or Episcopalian, they can transform the wine into blood, which a Methodist and a Baptist cannot. A minister cannot. They can say, we're going to do this in remembrance of what happened, but they cannot say this is the blood. And so, Judaism had its priesthood because it had people who performed blood sacrifice. Now there is no blood sacrifice, and the authority in Judaism is going to pass from the temple priesthood, and they're all dead, to the teachers. And the Hebrew word for teacher is rabbi. And a rabbi is someone who does not perform blood sacrifice. But what a rabbi does, what a teacher does, is they help you to figure out what is a worthy equivalent to blood sacrifice. So for example, if the Torah says, this happens and you will sacrifice a lamb, but we don't sacrifice lambs anymore. So then you have to say, well, so if this happens, what if I gave up food by fasting for 2 days? Or if this happens, what if I, instead of sacrificing a lamb, like bought some meat and donated it to the poor or something, whatever is the equivalent. So this is going to be the end of temple Judaism, which is actually not like Judaism at all. It's going to be the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, which we know as modern Judaism. So, and how that happens and the Mishnah and the Talmud, we will look at that in our next session. So, thank you very much. Thank you. Are you like really on the edge of your seat about that?